Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, and I'm here with the great London Paul. And Paul, last week we gave sort of a basic foundation of what was going on with the Kursk incursion. And admittedly, it was still early enough. There wasn't a whole lot of valid information that we could say, yes, this is happening, this is going on. Now we know a little bit more. We still don't have the whole picture, especially since we're taking a look at the way foreign entities are responding to it, which is something we're going to talk about in another podcast. But the one thing that stood out to me is how analysts in the West are trying to pinpoint this as sort of a repeat of the German movement under Operation Citadel in World War II into Kursk and the inevitability of its demise. But frankly, I looked into something that had a little bit more historic relevance, not quite exactly repeating, but definitely rhyming. And that was during World War I, during the Michael Offensive. The Michael Offensive, of course, was when you had the stagnant lines, and Germany suddenly got this windfall of with the Soviet Union, or the fall of Russia during the revolution. They got 1 million men they could carry over, and they found a little breakthrough in the line. And what they did is they just shot through, and the Allies really weren't prepared for it. And so the Germans were running roughshod. Unfortunately, they were moving so fast that they ended up not or losing control with their supply lines and a number of other things. But the reality is that the Michael offensive failed because of planning, because of really having an ultimate goal. And when that offensive failed, the end of World War I was just months away. And I see this parallel happening where this desperate move by Zelensky and maybe those who are aiding him, trying to extend the war when they're losing territory hand over foot in the Donetsk and Donbass and the other different regions going through. And it looks like you're taking a powerful battalion of men and machines trying to go into Kursk, where you know inevitably you're going to fail, in the meantime taking away from the real front. And it seems like it's just going to be an absolute waste, both for a political purpose and for a military purpose. And the end of the war seems more and more inevitable. Want to get your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, first off, you're absolutely right. It's an ongoing development, and it's certainly worthy of us coming back to discuss the point. As ever, it's very complicated, and it's very easy to get a bit of a rush of blood to the head and try and talk about 10 different things simultaneously and lose focus on what we need to discuss. So I think we probably need to break it down. So I think we should start talking first off about the operation itself, what's in very broad terms unfolded, and then who people feel is responsible for this, and what the various permutations are, what the initial Russian response was, which you mentioned obviously before we came on air, Ken, which feeds into a number of possibilities. And I think we should work on that basis. And then, from there, we can start to dissect other areas, because I think I've seen too many commentaries just trying to obviously make sense of it all in one sentence or one small conversation. And it's impossible to do that because there are so many different permutations in play. But what I think I should start with saying before we actually get into the nuts and bolts of it, and I know we've said this before, but it's worth repeating. In a very broad sense, the United States is absolutely terrified of provoking Russia into any form of direct conflict with the United States. Now, a lot of people simply will not believe that, but the bottom line is, and it's not a contradiction, the United States has always seen the Ukraine war as an opportunity to remove Putin, to destroy the Russian economy, financial system, the ruble, end up balkanizing the country, stealing all the assets. That's, an aspiration. Of course, it's never going to happen. But in the next breath, and I think as this war's progressed, the Americans have started to see Russian technology they didn't know or didn't believe exist. And it does. And that can even be drone technology, not just hypersonic. And also how, as the war's progressed, Russia's adapted and it's producing new technology in a matter of months to aid its war effort. And this has totally shocked the Americans. So they may have started the war feeling, that they were in charge, they were in control, that it was a fait accompli, which of course it never was. But now they're desperately anxious never to upset the Russians too much. So if there's ever something that might be a grey area or something open to interpretation, they're very quick to get on the phone and tell the Russians, look, nothing to do with us. No, we don't agree with this. No, go easy on us. Sometimes we have to say things on the world stage so we look tough, but we don't mean it. I'm sure you understand this. And to have that attitude and to be very cognizant of that on a repeated basis for probably, I would say, at least a year, maybe 2 years, or out somewhere in that window. I know it's rather a large window, but it's to emphasize the point that for me, that affirms the perspective that, and we have to be careful how we say this, the US administration was not in any way, shape, or form responsible for what happened in Kursk. Now, I know everybody says it's NATO, and it's very convenient, certainly for the Russians, to say that. And here's why it's convenient for Russia to be able to say that NATO was responsible for this, because in essence, that's a major red flag. Not only in this is the Russian perspective, but we have to talk about each side's perspectives on this. It's not about who's right and who's wrong. But from the Russian perspective, as far as they're concerned, that's a major red line. Not only have the Ukrainians invaded Russia itself. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't be justified to do that, given in the context that Russia invaded Ukraine. But from the Russian perspective, that's just a bridge too far. Now, the argument is, and the risk is, and we've said this before, that Russia may decide on the basis of this ultimately to say we're no longer fighting a special military operation. We're actually going to fight a proper war. We will declare war, and that will be devastating for Ukraine. So we have to hope at all costs that never happens. But also from a US perspective, they are extremely frightened what that could mean. And I'm not saying that Russia's going to start bombing NATO countries, but it's if they were to declare war, what would they do? How would this look? This would make the United States' position untenable. NATO would probably disappear in the blink of an eye. And it would start a snowballing effect, which would be very, very damaging for the United States and its position in Europe and NATO, etc. So under no circumstances did they ever want this special military operation to escalate into a war. Now, if the United States, and we'll call it the administration, which covers the Pentagon and other elements inside the Beltway, so to speak, if I would say they weren't aware of it. Now, it doesn't mean there weren't rogue elements somewhere in the US. There might be rogue elements operating, we don't know, who may have assisted in some capacity with Kursk. The same could be applied potentially to the United Kingdom also. I mean, and something we mentioned before we came on air, Ken, and it's the thing that I think has typified this war, is the way the British are being far more gung-ho and in their language, far more antagonistic. Okay, the argument is Johnson went and talked Zelensky out of ending the war in April 2022. Was he sent by the Americans, or was he in fact did it have nothing to do with the Americans? That we will probably never know, but maybe we will in the fullness of time. So there's an argument from some quarters, well, the British are involved. Well, again, if you go on a sort of like-for-like basis and you look at the government of the UK, I don't think they're going to entertain any sort of idea of assisting in that capacity to attack Kursk with a plan for the Ukrainians without the United States being aware of it. And therefore, does that mean there isn't any British involvement whatsoever? Well, potentially there is, but just because there are mercenaries from Germany or Poland or whoever, or France or wherever it is, doesn't automatically make the assumption that NATO's involved. But as I said, for Russia, it's a very good reason to say NATO's involved. Now, of course, there's been denials from the West. There's also the matter of Zelensky coming out and saying it was on our head, no one else was involved, and we'll park that for a minute and talk about that in a second. But in general, when you look at the situation from the Russian perspective, whether there is direct NATO involvement or not, it's a very good excuse for them, because it will put the United States seriously on the back foot. What I would say with regards to the plan, and we've said many times, the West is clueless, but the idea that the West would say, I know, I've got a plan. You've been holding this contact line pretty well. They've lost Bakhmut in a few places, but the Ukrainians have done pretty well with enormous losses, of course. I'm not diminishing any of that aspect to it. But that contact line, what you're going to do then, here's the plan, Ukraine. You're going to abandon that contact line, and you're going to send all those forces to take the war to Russia. Now, I don't for 1 minute believe anyone in the West is going to go, I think that's a good idea. The whole plan is so bad, it's even worse than anything the West could ever implement or decide to implement. So I don't, for me, see any evidence in that regard they were responsible. I don't think the United States ever wants to take the risk, because, as I said, the risk is, from their perspective and the fear, well, if Russia declares war, maybe they will take it to NATO countries. Maybe they'll start going, well, you've provided these weapons. Where do those F-16s come from? You don't know what's going through the US's head, because they're petrified, literally, of what the Russian response could be, because they know militarily Russia is light years ahead. I've said this for years, but now I think increasingly that's understood to be the case. So I'll stop there, Ken, because I don't want to just hog the conversation, obviously, but they're just some thoughts initially, and there's an awful lot more to think about with regards to where we are in this current, obviously, offensive. As much as it's largely fizzled out, there's still a lot to discuss about it.
Yeah, there's two important points, actually 3 important points. One I think we're going to discuss maybe in the next podcast. The first one is the Zelensky has already come out and tried to say nobody else was involved. And if you're going to publicly say nobody else is involved, then you're covering, more likely you're covering for who was involved in helping set up the planning and giving the motivation to Zelensky to do this. Second thing is the British. You pointed out that the British. Well, there was an interesting story that came out in the Sunday Times, where they were outright boasting of the UK's leading role in the high-risk operation, using Challenger 2 battle tanks, including many the mercenaries. And we want to emphasize this. This is not necessarily from the British, US, NATO military itself. A lot of the conflicts are done with mercenaries from other countries that are not necessarily done with the permission of the governments. Take a look at World War II, where before the US got involved after 1941, Americans were helping the RAF on the ground. Then there was, of course, that book from Ernest Hemingway, For Whom the Bell Tolls, where you had Americans who were involved in the Spanish Civil War. Or if you go into Asia, where Americans, the Flying Tigers, were helping the Chinese in Burma. So there's many different instances, not just recent times of private security military, where individuals, mercenaries, will go without the permission or orders of their government to help this. So I think that's what you have, but many of those mercenaries are trained military or former military. And so they could have an understanding of the tactics, strategy, planning, maybe even having access to intel. You know, you take a look at what the US did about what, 5 years ago, 5, 6 years ago, by signing off on the Five Eyes sharing of intel. You have multiple different countries that could be providing this intelligence that the US doesn't even know about because it's a shared intel database. So satellite plans, etc. That's where it gets more complex, and it's really more difficult to pinpoint down exactly who was involved and who gave the order. It's more likely that, you know, Zelensky could also be feeling pressure from his own political party that if he doesn't do something, that, you know, his tenure in office, if not his life, is in danger. We don't know the whole extent of that. Maybe we'll find out in the coming days. But in the end, you're absolutely right. This was an attempted gesture that the only inevitable outcome would be for Russia to decide, you know, this is a red line, we're going to escalate, and it's already happened to a certain extent. Shortly after Putin, who, you know, you could say that, you know, there's good information, and I think you've talked about it, that Russia knew about this and allowed it to happen, or potentially did. But when Putin was shown on television, his body language was one not of, I don't want to say surprise, but more of frustration and anger. And shortly after, they actually designated Kursk as a counter-terrorist operation, so separate from the SMO. And one of the things about the counter-terrorist operation means there is no prisoners. Eliminate and eradicate everything, salt the earth, boom, for what they did. So there's already been a slight escalation, not quite to the level of declaring an all-out war, but this could mean that the SMO at the front in Ukraine could suddenly see itself escalate to an even higher level.
Yeah, let's deal with the three things you said again, because first you mentioned Zelensky and the claims he's making. Now, what I can say, and I've talked about it on my own podcasts, Zelensky has been looking to try and go on the offensive all this year, and he's been talked down multiple times by all accounts by his own military, saying this is reckless and you can't do this. So there is a precedent for him to do this, and I think as much as any, the precedent is, we know the West is tired of the war. The West is beginning to wane in its support, and we'll save that for another conversation, but that's a statement of fact. So he thinks, well, if I go on the offensive and we have some success, now, of course, it's desperation time. There's no other word for it. So if you set the desperation aside and you think, well, we can actually achieve our objectives, then it reignites enthusiasm to support the war effort. Wow, he's taken it to Russia. He's in Russia. Maybe there is a way to win this war after all, and then we'll throw the kitchen sink again and give him a whole bunch of other weapons. I mean, this isn't about logical thinking. This is an act of desperation, because you've had a war for 2.5 years, and the statement's constantly being, we're going to win the war. And if you're suddenly not going to win the war, and all the instability and problems inside Ukraine, that creates an enormous headache with an enormous amount of unknown variables for Zelensky and in a broader sense, whoever's governing Ukraine at this point in time. So that's one aspect to this. Another aspect in saying, well, it's solely us responsible. Well, there's a number of, it could be, as you said, Ken, covering for someone, or it's just basically telling the truth. And, and as I said, the fact that you would go in and compromise the contact line in eastern Ukraine and not have any backup, just throw these resources into Russia, it's just not, there's no plan to this. That's not even an act of desperation. It's just a suicide mission on the worst possible scale. We've seen that from the whole of the war with these horrendous, but sadly, truthfully named meat grinders. So that tends to suggest it could well have been an operation that was just primarily Ukraine, and not everyone in Ukraine necessarily agreed with it. I think that's entirely a possibility. And it's interesting where this story came out, that originally Zelensky approved it, then he said, no, we're not doing it, and Zelensky and whoever decided to carry it out anyway. I mean, that might, the people mentioned may not exactly have anything to do with the reality, but it could be something, and maybe you can slot whatever names in you want into that equation. And in fact, who knows what's gone on. And I don't want to speculate, but what I'm trying to say is, there could be a heck of a lot of people involved in this who were decision makers. Doesn't mean everyone in Ukraine was part of that process by any stretch of the imagination. With regards to the UK, like you say, almost trying to brag about it, well, no, the UK has made a lot of, as we said, very, very foolish statements that could have, in any other period in history, could have led to a world war. It didn't, because the world's very different. But you do feel that not everybody, but there are elements in the UK whose, in inverted commas, beef with Russia is far worse than any other country on this planet. And that's saying something, because there's a lot of people who have a real problem with Russia in the United States, for example. I mean, we know that to be a statement of fact, but the UK, I think, has the hatred and resentment and anger and everything is far worse than anywhere else. So, I think the fact that the media's come out and said this was because there was an idea, well, Russia's going to be defeated, and there has been noise coming out of the UK. Well, this is turning the war, this kind of belief in something that has no basis in reality is not a new phenomenon. It's happened throughout the whole of the war. And I think it was the idea, well, this time we'll win, so let's get some credit for this. But it doesn't mean that the UK was involved, other than in some very small capacity. And involved could have been, well, 6 months ago, someone suggested, should we do this? And maybe that's something to think about in the future. And then it got parked. I mean, but I feel there is more reason to believe that NATO countries weren't involved. And that's something we'll discuss in part 2 in terms of reactions, which tends to support that perspective. With regards to Russia and Putin's response, well, that could be partly, that doesn't mean that he wasn't aware it was going to happen. It's just his anger or frustration or disappointment was because, despite knowing, the Russians didn't respond how he wanted them to respond. Meaning, it's one thing knowing about it, it's one thing doing nothing about it, but it's another thing going, we know it's going to happen because satellite technology has shown us, and reconnaissance, that all these forces have moved away from the contact line. They've gone somewhere else. Where have they gone? Oh, they're heading towards Sumy and to cross the border into Russia. That's a world difference to then going, well, we're aware of this, so we need to have these forces here. We need these people operationally situated there. So basically, we're going to catch them when they come over the border and end the conflict rapidly, but say we have prevented an escalation of this conflict with Ukraine crossing into Kursk. So it can be both things. He can know full well it's going to happen, but be furious that the response was half-hearted and initially. And the other thing I think is, if Russia was that bothered about this, they would have pulled their forces out of the contact line in Donetsk and try, but they're not. They're just very casual, just bringing in some more reserves, some conscripts, sticking them in into Kursk, and just dealing with things in a very, very calm way. They haven't had a knee-jerk reaction to the fact we were caught with our trousers down and we have to look hard and tough but compromise the contact line in Donetsk. They've refused to do that. That's why because Ukraine's pulled the forces out of that region, they've taken 10, 15, 20 kilometers a day and taking 3, 4, 5, 6 villages a day instead of 1, maybe 2. So there are reasons to suggest also that they were aware of it. And that's why I said the reaction doesn't always have to be a binary bet. It can be, it can all amount to the same thing. And I do suspect there are certainly, if you look from the West perspective, they're going, well, Russia didn't have any defense on the border. It seems like the border is so porous, you can just walk over the border. There's a war going on, and there was no one there. I mean, that alone, for me, as much as in the West, people go, oh, look, shows how much of a failure Russia's military policy and tactics and operations are. But for me, it's the biggest indication they probably did know, because you would be immensely surprised to think they didn't have any forces anywhere near the border, and meaning anyone could cross the border. Because the thing is, at the end of the day, you don't necessarily have to cross the border with a battalion and several thousand forces and hardware. You could move over the border with a few people with some heavy weaponry and then start firing it from inside Russian territory and cause immense damage that way. It's not, this isn't like the war of old where you had to march thousands and thousands of military personnel to achieve an objective. I mean, just look at what drones have done. Drone technology has transformed warfare in ways that I think Ukraine war will be remembered as the war that changed the whole complexity of all wars, and that we've talked about that previously. So I think, again, there's just many, many facets to this particular situation, and we have to think about 50, 100 different things almost simultaneously, and then chew them through and go, okay, but is this possible that it can mean all these things, even though some of them are contradictory? And I feel that is the case. As I say, I think the Russians knew full well it was going to happen, but how they initially reacted or were prepared for this was probably deemed woeful by Putin and others in the military. So I don't doubt some heads will roll, and people will claim it's deliberate. He's got fifth columnists in his military ranks. No, sometimes they just make bad decisions, and in war you replace people. So yes, it's bad from the Russian perspective, but it's not, something catastrophic or something nefarious, and there's far more to it then, because then you're just straying into conspiratorial theories and ideas that you can easily say, but there's no substance to support that perspective. But I think overall, the operation looks like Ukraine's lost thousands of personnel. Interestingly, the Russians have come out and claimed that they're just leaving all the mercenaries and not taking their bodies with them when they're in retreat. Okay, I don't know personally if that's the case, but that's the Russian claim. that kind of wouldn't surprise me if it was happening. But evidently, yes, at times the Ukrainians are killing some Russians or seizing a tank, and you'd think it was the end of the war and they'd won. But that's just the same kind of nonsense that came out when Russia retreated in Kharkov and Kherson. You'd think they'd lost the war. Well, of course, that wasn't reality. But I mean, yes, Russia has suffered casualties. Yes, there are civilian casualties. But again, the argument is if Russia knew this was happening, then you'd have taken remedial action already and evacuated places and put measures in place to limit the threat to civilians, because civilians certainly have been killed. We know that to be the case. So I think in that regard, for many people, I think they think it's an open and shut case as to who's involved, why they're involved. But I think from the United States' perspective, and we talk about them because really they're the dominant power in this alliance. Power is the wrong word, but they're the ones who are more in control of what's going on or could be going on or should be going on. And for me, when you look at what's actually unfolded, this doesn't suit them at all. In fact, it puts them in a very awkward situation. They also now don't know how Russia's going to react. I mean, it's like, is Russia going to suddenly say they've had enough and declare war? And what would that mean? Does it mean that war's confined to Ukraine, or will they then decide to take that war further? Because the bottom line is, and this is the problem for the US, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but we've had these hypothetical discussions before, where what happens if Russia suddenly decides that they're going to take military action against the Baltic republics? If they did do that, America's going to turn around and do nothing to defend them. Why? Because the United States doesn't want to go to war with Russia. And that's why it fights proxy war, thinking someone else can do the dirty work and we'll reap the benefits. Well, that's never going to happen. And the point is, if the United States did nothing and was this paper tiger, then it's the end of NATO. The European Union would fall apart. The disintegration of the transatlantic alliance would almost be instant. And that's the United States' worst nightmare. It's always been about keeping Germany and Russia apart, preventing Eurasian integration. Well, that may well now have been the case, that could end up happening. And if it does, for the US, it's the worst disaster that could ever befall them in the modern era, apart from a nuclear war devastating their country, for argument's sake, which is why they equally never want that to happen. So I don't think this is at all is any way advantageous for the US. Certainly, I mean, the Nord Stream story, and I think we can link that in the next discussion, Ken, because I think there are elements to that are extremely interesting and telling as well. I mean, there might be also now deemed an opportunity to throw Ukraine under the bus 100% and find a way to extricate themselves from the war and try to keep the alliance going, meaning the NATO alliance, the transatlantic alliance, the US controlling Europe with the Atlanticists. But this is not a situation the US is comfortable with. And I just want to make a side issue to that point. It's rather like the whole thing in West Asia. And I stand by my point. The US never wanted to go to war with Ukraine. It's self-evidently with Iran. And that's been self-evident for 10.5 months. They have done everything to prevent that happening because, again, the consequences will be devastating for them. They have no control or understanding what that means and what it could do for their status in West Asia, what it would mean for Israel, and what that could mean for the future nation state of Israel. Yeah, the United States will always want to enter conflicts with proxies where there's no collateral damage coming their way. As soon as there's risk of collateral damage, they'll run the opposite way. They'll find an excuse to leave and go, well, and claim victory and go home and pretend it never happened, because that's how they operate. Well, this Kursk offensive potentially now puts the United States suffering collateral damage, not necessarily directly, but indirectly, because of the fallout of what Russia may do going forward. And I think that's an extremely important point to make.
You know, I'll go ahead and end this discussion here with a couple of similarities that popped in my head, going back to what I first suggested, that this is almost like a rhyme in history of the Michael offensive. When Germany had bust through the trench lines and had run roughshod farther and faster than had happened in the last three years of the war. The generals came before General Ludendorff, who was the tactical and strategic leader of the German/Prussian army, and they asked him, "What's the objective?" And Ludendorff said, "We'll just let them go and see how it goes." There was no objective. And I think this is exactly what we see in Kursk. It was just a chance to make Russia look bad, potentially the thought that it would bring down Putin because he was no longer invulnerable. But in the end, it was just going to be a slow grinding slaughter. The other thing is that somebody's made this point. In the modern day, we see this in Israel, and we see this both with the Ukrainian soldiers. This is the TikTok war. Everybody's got to stop what they're doing to make a video to put out there. And one of the things that's standing is there's a big grocery store that some Ukrainian soldiers have been gorging themselves and shooting up the retail stores and making videos of it. And I was reminded that the one thing that really killed the Michael offensive was when the German soldiers who had been living on stark rations for years ended up in the French city of Albert. And all of a sudden they saw food and drink that they hadn't seen for years, and they gorged themselves. And they wasted about 6 to 12 hours. And it was just enough to allow the Allies to get into place and pretty much end the Michael offensive. So those two things, coupled with, you know, the other aspects that are coming through, this Kursk incursion, while publicly for the media may be a propaganda, you know, cornucopia, in the end, it really will accomplish nothing and simply accelerate the end of the war. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this conversation.
And likewise.
And to everybody here, I want to thank you for being a part of the community. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, give your thoughts. We definitely read those and take a look. And tell anyone to join in with the community. So until the next time, everybody have a wonderful day.
And I'll obviously say goodbye too. And thanks for all your support, which obviously Ken and I greatly appreciate. Okay, and with that, we'll end the podcast.